was seen by many people to be under threat. And very interestingly, Social Democrats and Socialists in the Labour Party profoundly believed that the family was a key building block of the new society. Not least because the demographics of that population were radically changing. So remember how at the beginning of this course I was talking about how 60% of the country in the 1840s was under 24 years old. Okay? And now, after basically almost a century of the slow decline of birth rates, you have an incredibly aging population. 1901, 30% of the population was under 15 and 5% over 65. By 1951, okay, 25% of the country were under 15, fall of 5%, and 10% over 65. And we all know that one of the great strains upon welfare systems is the way in which that aging population, the burdens of the aging population, are placed under the welfare systems that were created in the 1940s. So the question was, how do you keep together the family in these conditions, okay, with an aging population and with divorce rates rising? Well, one key element of family policy for the Labour Party was the introduction of the Universal Family Allowance in 1945. Remember, Eleanor Rathbone and the New Feminists in the 1920s and 30s had argued for the introduction of a wage to women for their unpaid domestic labour. Okay? This was Rathbone's great crusade. In 1945, she only half gets her way. Women are paid a family allowance, but it's paid not to the woman for her labour, but to the child. Okay? But it's the child who receives the payment, not literally. The mother goes down to the post office and picks up the cheque, but it's the payment is made for the child. And the cartoon here is of a woman going to the post office to pick up her family allowances, with as many things that she can pass off as her children as possible, because the amount of family allowance that you got rose with the number of children that you get. And it was a universal flat rate. It made no difference whether you were a millionaire or homeless. You would get the same allowance for each child. Okay? It was a universal flat rate. So far so good. That seems sort of promising, a bit of a come down from Rathbone, but still, a good start. A family allowance paid for the child for their health and maintenance. However, the social security system remained deeply gendered. It was the male breadwinner who remained the key object of the system of social security. And widows and married women were basically positioned as dependents on a male breadwinner. The labour movement in many ways got its way. The trade union movement basically got its way in the defence and the prioritisation of the male wage. One of the things that means is that as after the First World War, so after the Second World War, you have a real injunction upon women to get out of the labour force. And as in the First World War, so in the Second World War, lots of women had gone into war industries to support the war effort. After the war, they were told that they basically had to get back and do their duty in the home. Okay? Between 1931 and 1951, the numbers of married women working had risen from 10% to 22%. So there's a significant rise, but increasingly those women are pathologized because it is argued by psychologists like this key figure John Bowlby, who wrote Maternal Care and Health in 1951 and Child Care and the Growth of Love in 1953, based on his study of evacuated children in the Second World War, Remember, I talked about that psychological trauma of separation. That absent mothers, that is, women in the workforce, produced antisocial children. So that the job of a mother was to make sure that her bond of attachment with her children was secured by staying at home. Okay? Therefore, if you have an antisocial child, it's basically your fault for not having stayed at home and looked after them. Bowlby's theory was incredibly influential in post-war psychoanalysis and social work in Britain. Indeed, is still pretty influential in psychoanalysis in the US today. Education. I'm going to have to speed up. 1944, the Education Act comes out of the national government, the wartime national government. And minister responsible for it was actually a Conservative minister, Rab Butler. What the 1944 Education Act does is make school compulsory up until the age of 15, importantly, so that all Britons get some degree of secondary education. They'd only previously had elementary education. And was meant to create a system based upon parity of esteem, that all schools would basically have the same social status. And to achieve that, they don't abolish private schools that you pay for, which seems like the obvious thing that you would do if you wanted to create parity of esteem, but they abolish fee-paying grammar schools. Okay? That is to say that grammar schools, which was a hybrid to the private-public thing, now either went fully private or were maintained fully by public funds through something called the direct grant. They put an enormous amount of resources into building new schools. Okay? It's a huge building program. 536 new secondary schools built in the decade after the Second World War. But, as you're going to find with hospitals, most of the new schools remained basically housed in a Victorian infrastructure. So 5,000 schools continued to be basically built from the old board schools that were created in the 1870s. Okay, so you have a new social democratic educational system housed in the Victorian schools of liberal education created in 1870. The last real sense of the sort of universal ambition of social democracy in terms of education was that school meals were made compulsory. All schools had to provide school meals for their pupils. However, you were means tested to find out who had to pay for a lunch and who would get it free. Okay, so there was a means test that mark out those people that were poor enough to get a free lunch. Everybody else got had to make a basic payment. And this lasted down to 1968, where our friend Mrs. Margaret Thatcher was the minister responsible for the abolition of the universal school meals program. School kids like me grew up knowing Margaret Thatcher as the milk snatcher, because we were given little bottles of milk, little quarter bottles of milk that sat outside in the warm when the birds would sort of peck the cream off the top, and suddenly they weren't there anymore. It was like we were robbed of our birthright. Okay, let's move on. So here you see a great example of one of these modernist modernist school designs built in 1950. This is from Edge Hill in Liverpool, built in the middle of the 1950s. The problem with the system was that actually it served to reinscribe class differences, not to erase them. And the principal reason for this was that at age 11, students had to take a test that would stream them into one of three types of schools. It was called the 11 plus. I took it and failed. Gavin, did you take it? Did you pass? I'm jealous. I failed. It was a very traumatic experience because I'm actually christened Nicholas. My name is actually Nicholas James, and no one ever called me Nicholas. I never, I knew I was good, but I didn't know how to spell it. So the very first thing that I faced in the 11 plus was having to write my name, and I didn't know how to spell my name at age 11. Don't think I've ever recovered from a moment of such academic humiliation. Although yesterday, on Thursday's lecture, when I couldn't remember how to describe an air force, came quite close to it. So at 11, you take this test. If you pass it, you proceed in two directions. You either go to a technical school or you go to a grammar school. Okay? And all of this was based around the theory of this educational theorist, Cyril Norwood, who said there are three types of minds that exist: the concrete, the abstract, and the mechanical. Okay? And these basically neatly map onto different class positions. So the grammar schools were for people with abstract minds, people like you with a liberal arts training who can think abstractly and cleverly. You go onto a grammar school. That's 15% of the school population. If you had a mechanical mind, you went to a technical college, okay? And that was 7% of the population. They were called secondary technical colleges. If you were, however, had a concrete mind, like clearly I did at age 11, you went to a secondary modern school, where 78% of school children went, and this education was designed to prepare you for a life of manual labour, where you left school at 15 and worked semi-skimmed, unskilled, and maybe partly skilled work for the rest of your life. Okay, so basically class is deeply inscribed in this new educational system. So too with higher education. Of course, one of the great social experiments of the post-war period in the US was the GI Bill. Britain had no GI Bill. The university population in Britain remained a deeply elitist one, actually right down to the late 1980s. Okay? Only 2% of 18-year-olds went to university in 1939. By 1963, that had basically doubled to 4%, and a whole new series of universities had been built. Places like Nottingham and Southampton and Hull and Exeter and Leicester and Keele. A lot of that growth was channeled into the sciences and technology, as well as in the social sciences. Because these were the people who were going to build the brand new technocratic, shiny future of the social democracy. So if you're a worker and you've been to a secondary modern school and you've been in the workforce, your only hope of any type of further education was through the WEA, the Workers' Educational Association, that was set up in 1945 and had about 20,000 students shortly afterwards. By 1963, fewer than 1 in 100 working class children made it to university. Okay? Let me just repeat that. By 1963, fewer than 1 in 100 working class children actually went to a university. Okay, health. My God, I'm going to have to speed up. Okay. And I'm sure you're probably interested in this, so I'll speed up as slowly as I can. Before the war, there was basically a tripartite system, health system, that was done partly through charitable hospitals, partly through private pay, private insurance schemes, and partly through what you would call social insurance schemes, either through social insurance itself or through friendly societies, sort of sickness clubs they were called, where you put a little away every month in case you got sick. In the late 1930s, even the British Medical Association